They say a man's life can turn on a door he almost didn't open. And that morning Ethan Cole nearly walked past his stable like he had 100 times before, boots crunching over dry dirt, sun just breaking over the low hills, the smell of hay and horse sweat hanging thick in the cool air. But something was off, something in the way the horses shifted, restless, ears pinned, not fear exactly, more like they were waiting. And Ethan paused with his hand on the wooden latch, feeling the rough grain under his palm, listening, just listening. Because out here, listening kept you alive longer than any gun ever could. And then he pushed the door open, and everything inside the stable seemed to hold its breath at once. Dust lifting in slow golden lines through the cracks of morning light. The horses stepping back, forming a quiet circle as if they knew something he didn't. And that's when he saw her, tied at the wrists with coarse rope, half hidden in the hay, dark hair tangled with straw, clothes worn from travel, not broken, not helpless, just still, watching, her eyes already on him like she'd been waiting for that exact moment, not surprised, not relieved, just measuring him. The way a person measures a storm before deciding whether to stand or run. And Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with the smell of leather and dust thick in his lungs. Because he'd seen enough of this land to know trouble didn't always ride in loud. Sometimes it waited quiet in your own barn, and her gaze didn't drop, didn't soften. It held steady, sharp as flint, like she'd already made up her mind about him and was waiting to see if she was right. And somewhere far off, too far to be clear, but close enough to matter, came the faint echo of hooves on hard ground. Just a rhythm at first, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but Ethan heard it, felt it in the way the horses shifted again. And he looked back at her, really looked this time, saw the rope marks, saw the way she held herself even sitting down like she wasn't someone who stayed down for long. And something in his chest tightened, not pity, not yet, something older than that, something like recognition without memory, and still. He said nothing, because words out here were cheap and often wrong. And finally she spoke first, voice low, steady, carrying the dust of long miles. If you're going to decide, do it before they get here. And that was when the sound of hooves came again, clearer now, not many, maybe 3 or 4 riders, moving fast, too fast for a casual visit, and Ethan's jaw set just a fraction. The kind of movement you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. And she noticed everything. Her eyes flicking once toward the door, then back to him, not begging, not pleading, just waiting. And he realized then she wasn't asking to be saved. She was waiting to see what kind of man stood in front of her. And that mattered more than anything else. More than the rope, more than the riders coming, more than whatever had brought her here in the first place. And Ethan exhaled slowly. The kind of breath a man takes before stepping into something he can't step back out of. And he moved, crossing the stable in measured steps, each one deliberate, until he stood over her, close enough to see the fine dust on her skin, the tension in her shoulders, the readiness that hadn't left her even tied down. And he crouched, pulling a small knife from his belt, the blade catching a thin line of morning light. And for a second, just a second, her muscles tensed like she might bolt even with her hands bound. And then he cut the rope clean, quick, no hesitation, and the fibers fell away like they'd never held her at all. And still he didn't offer a hand, didn't say a word, just stood back and gave her space. Because some things weren't given, they were taken or they meant nothing. And she rose on her own, steady, slower than she probably wanted but not weak, never weak. And outside the hoofbeats grew louder, close now. Close enough to stir dust at the edge of the yard, and Ethan turned his head just slightly toward the sound, then back to her, and in that quiet, in that narrow space, between what was coming and what had already begun, something unspoken passed between them, not trust, not yet, something harder, something like agreement, and without another word, Ethan stepped to the stable door, pulled it shut, and dropped the iron latch into place from the inside as the first shadow of a rider crossed the gap beneath the wood, and the world outside narrowed to the sound of breathing, hers and his, steady, waiting for whatever would come next. The sound outside did not rush in. It pressed slowly against the walls like heat before a storm, hooves settling into stillness, leather creaking, men shifting in their saddles, and inside the stable the air grew tighter, thicker, every breath measured as Ethan stood with his hand still resting near the latch, not gripping it, just aware of it, while the woman moved a single step back into the shadow of the stall, not hiding, not exactly, just placing herself where she could see both him and the narrow lines of light cutting through the wood. And for a moment neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say that would change what was already here. And then a voice came from outside, calm but edged, the kind of voice used to being answered. "We are looking for something that does not belong here." And Ethan did not answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words, as if weighing them against the dust in the air and the quiet behind him. And the woman's eyes shifted to him again, sharper now, searching for the decision he had already made but had not yet shown. And Ethan finally spoke, his voice even, not raised, not lowered. "You are a long way from anything that concerns you." And there was a pause, not long, but enough to carry meaning, enough for the men outside to understand they were not dealing with someone who startled easy. And one of the horses outside snorted softly. The sound of a hand brushing its neck followed, slow. "Patient, we will not be long," the voice said again, and this time there was something else beneath it, something that suggested they already knew more than they were saying. And inside, the woman shifted her weight, just slightly, enough for Ethan to notice the way she favored one side, not injured in a way that slowed her mind, but enough to matter if things turned worse, and his gaze dropped for the briefest second before returning to the door. And the silence stretched again, long, enough for the dust to settle back to the ground, long enough for a man to reconsider. And then Ethan stepped away from the latch, not toward the door, but toward the center of the stable, putting distance between himself and the exit as if to say without words that he was not opening it. Not now, not for them. And that was when the woman spoke again, quieter this time, almost lost beneath the sound of shifting leather outside. "You do not know what they will do." And Ethan did not look at her. When he answered, "I know what I will not do." And the words settled between them like something heavier than either of them expected. And outside, a boot hit the ground. Then another, footsteps moving closer, stopping just on the other side of the door, close enough that Ethan could hear the slow breath of the man standing there, could almost feel the presence through the wood. And the voice came again, lower now, closer. "Last chance, rancher." And Ethan's eyes narrowed just a fraction at the word, not offended, not surprised, just recognizing the shift, recognizing that whatever this was had already crossed from question into expectation. And behind him, the woman's hand brushed lightly against the rough wood of the stall, not reaching for a weapon, not yet, just grounding herself in something solid, something real. And Ethan noticed that too, noticed everything, the way she did not panic, the way she did not plead, the way she simply stood ready for whatever came next. And it changed something, small but certain, like a door opening in a place he had kept closed for years. And he exhaled slowly, stepping once more, this time toward the side of the stable where a narrow window let in a thin slice of light, enough to see the outline of the yard beyond, the shapes of riders waiting, still mounted, still patient, and one man standing at the door, hat low, posture easy but not careless. And Ethan took that in, every detail, committing it to memory the way men out here learned to do without thinking. And then he stepped back into shadow, turning his attention once more to the woman. And for the first time since he had opened that door, he studied her without the distraction of what was outside, saw the steadiness in her eyes, the quiet strength in the way she held herself, and something in his expression shifted, not soft, not yet, but no longer distant. And he spoke, just enough for her to hear, "They are not leaving." And she answered just as quietly, "No." And there was no fear in it, only certainty. And the hoofbeats outside had stopped completely now, replaced by stillness so complete it felt louder than noise. And in that stillness, the morning light crept higher, cutting sharper lines through the cracks in the wood, touching the edge of her face, the dust on her skin, the place where rope had marked her wrists. And Ethan saw it, saw all of it, and did not look away. And outside, the man at the door shifted once more, and then came the sound of knuckles against wood, not hard, not threatening, just deliberate. And Ethan did not move to answer it, did not reach for the latch, did not step forward. He simply stood where he was, between the door and the woman, not close enough to claim, not far enough to abandon. And in that space, something unspoken settled into place, something that would not break easily, no matter what waited on the other side of that door. The knock did not come again, and that was what made it worse. Not the silence itself, but the choice behind it. The kind of patience that did not belong to men who doubted what they were doing. And Ethan felt it settle into the wood of the stable, into the ground beneath his boots, into the quiet space between him and the woman who still had not taken her eyes off him. And outside, one of the riders shifted in the saddle, leather whispering against worn fabric, followed by the faint jingle of a bridle, small sounds that carried far in the still morning air. And then the voice returned, softer now, almost conversational. You are standing in the way of something that does not concern you. And Ethan let the words hang there for a moment, tasting them like dried dust, because out here, the way a man said something often mattered more than what he said, and this one was not asking anymore. Not really, and Ethan stepped closer to the door. Not enough to open it, just enough that his voice would carry without effort. Everything on this land concerns me, he said, and behind him, the woman's breathing slowed, steadier now, as if something in his answer had shifted the ground beneath her as well. And outside there was a pause again, longer this time, followed by a low murmur between the riders, not hurried, not uncertain, just confirming what they had already begun to understand. And then one of them laughed, not loud, not mocking, just a short sound that held no humor at all, and the man at the door spoke once more. Then you should understand what happens next. And the words did not carry threat, not directly, but they did not need to, because the truth of them was already clear. And inside, the air seemed to tighten another notch, the light shifting higher as the sun climbed, cutting sharper lines across the stable floor. And Ethan's gaze moved again, not to the door this time, but to the woman. And for the first time, he noticed something he had missed before, a thin cord resting against her neck, half hidden beneath dust and fabric, and at the end of it, a small piece of stone wrapped in silver wire, catching just enough light to draw the eye. And something about it stirred a memory he could not place, something old, something quiet, like a name you almost remember but cannot quite reach. And he held that thought for a second too long before letting it go, because whatever it meant, it was not the problem standing outside his door. And the woman saw his glance, saw where his attention had gone, and her hand lifted slightly, not to hide it, but to touch it, just once, like a reflex she did not question. And then her eyes returned to his, sharper now, more certain. If they take me, she said, voice low, steady, they will not stop there. And Ethan did not ask what that meant, did not need to, because the way she said it carried enough truth to fill the space between them. And outside, a boot scraped lightly against the ground, closer now, right up against the door. And then the handle shifted once, testing, not forcing, just confirming what they already knew, that it was locked, that the line had been drawn. And Ethan's shoulders settled, not tense, not relaxed, just set, like a man who had already chosen his ground and was not planning to move from it. And the horses behind him shifted again, uneasy but contained, their breath warm in the cool air, and the smell of hay and dust pressed in around them, grounding everything in something simple and real, something that did not change no matter who stood outside. And for a moment, the world narrowed down to that, to breath and wood and light, and the quiet presence of another person standing just a few feet away. And then the voice outside changed, not louder, not harsher, just closer to something honest. We know she is in there. And this time there was no space left for doubt, no room for misunderstanding. And Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze flicking once more to the woman. And in that brief look, something passed between them again, something clearer now, no longer just recognition, but understanding. And she gave the smallest nod, not asking, not pleading, just acknowledging what was already happening. And Ethan turned back to the door, placing his hand flat against the wood, feeling the grain, the solid weight of it, the thin barrier between two choices that could not both be true. And he spoke, quiet but firm. Then you already know I am not opening it. And outside, the silence that followed was different from the ones before, heavier, final, the kind that comes when a conversation has ended and something else has begun. And the riders did not move right away, did not rush, did not press. They simply stayed where they were, letting the stillness stretch, letting the sun climb higher, letting the moment settle into something that could not be undone. and inside. Ethan stepped back from the door once more, not retreating, just giving himself space to see clearly. And the woman moved as well, one step closer now, not enough to close the distance between them, but enough to show she was no longer standing apart. And her voice came again, softer than before, but stronger, in a way that did not need volume. You could still walk away from this. And Ethan almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was the first thing she had said that sounded like a question, even if she did not mean it that way, and he shook his head once, slow, certain. No, he said, and the words settled into the stable like a final nail driven into place, simple, unadorned, impossible to take back. And outside, the man at the door stepped away at last, his boots crunching softly over dirt, and the sound of movement followed, riders shifting, turning, not leaving, not yet, but changing position, preparing for something neither of them could see. And inside, the light grew brighter, the shadows shorter, and the space between Ethan and the woman seemed smaller than it had a moment before, as if the world itself had decided there was no room left for distance between them anymore. Out here, the longest moments were the ones where nothing seemed to happen, and Ethan Cole knew that kind of silence better than most, the kind that stretched thin until it almost snapped. And outside the stable, the riders had spread out just enough that their presence pressed in from every side, without a single raised voice, without a single rushed move. And inside, the light had shifted higher, turning the dust in the air into something bright and sharp, every particle visible, every breath, carrying it deeper into the lungs. And Ethan stood still, listening, counting the small sounds the way a man counts time when he does not trust a clock, a horse shifting 10 feet to the left, leather tightening somewhere near the fence line, a quiet murmur that stopped the moment it began, and none of it was careless, none of it was random, and that told him everything he needed to know. And behind him, the woman stepped closer again, just enough that he could feel the change in the air, not touching, not reaching, but no longer standing apart. And when she spoke this time, her voice carried something new, not urgency, not fear, something steadier than both. "They are not hunters," she said, and Ethan did not turn right away, because he had already felt that truth settling into place. "No," he answered, "they are not." And that changed the shape of things in a way that could not be undone, because hunters chased, they pushed, they forced mistakes, but these men outside were waiting, holding ground, and waiting meant purpose. And purpose meant something larger than one woman tied in a stable. And Ethan's gaze drifted once more to the narrow window, the strip of land beyond it now fully lit by morning sun, the outline of riders clearer, their posture calm, controlled, not tense in the way of men expecting a fight, but steady in the way of men who already believed they would get what they came for. And that belief was more dangerous than any weapon. And he stepped closer to the window, just enough to see without showing himself. And he counted them again, 4 on horseback, 1 on foot, the one who had stood at the door now moving slowly along the side of the building, not circling, not searching, just measuring the space, learning it. And Ethan felt something settle deeper in his chest, not fear, not quite, something heavier, something like understanding. And behind him, the woman's hand lifted again, this time not to the cord at her neck, but to the wood beside her, fingers brushing along the grain as if tracing something unseen. And Ethan noticed the way her breathing remained even, the way her shoulders did not rise or fall with tension. And it struck him then that whatever waited outside, she had already faced something worse before this morning ever began. And he turned to her, finally, really looking at her again, not as a stranger in his stable, not as trouble that had found him, but as someone standing inside the same moment he was, carrying the same weight of what came next. And he spoke, quieter now, not for the men outside, just for her. "Who are they?" And she met his gaze without hesitation, without deflection, and for the first time, there was no wall in her expression, no distance held back, just truth laid bare in the space between them. "They belong to the one who thinks I belong to him," she said, and the words did not rise, did not sharpen. They simply existed, and Ethan held them there, turning them over in his mind, feeling the weight of them settle into everything that had happened since he opened that door. And something in his expression shifted again, not anger, not surprise, something colder, something more deliberate. And he nodded once, slow, as if confirming something to himself rather than responding to her. And outside, the movement along the wall stopped. The man now positioned near the back of the stable, out of sight but not out of reach. And the riders adjusted again. Small shifts, careful, coordinated, and Ethan stepped away from the window, back toward the center, where the light cut strongest across the floor, and he stood there, grounded in it, letting it define the space, letting it remind him of what was his and what was not. And the woman watched him, her eyes following every movement, not questioning, not doubting, just learning, the way he had learned her in the last few minutes. And the silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with choices already made, with lines already drawn. And then from outside, the voice came once more, no longer at the door, no longer testing, but certain, clear enough to carry through wood and dust and distance. You are protecting something that was never yours. And Ethan did not answer right away, because this time the words did not settle the same way. They struck something deeper, something older, and he glanced once more at the woman, at the thin cord resting against her neck, at the way she stood without stepping back, without shrinking from the weight of what had been said. And then he turned toward the door again, not moving closer, just facing it fully now. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, low, and carried something that had not been there before, something that did not ask for understanding, did not invite argument. Nothing that stands in my barn is yours either. And outside, the stillness that followed was different again, not quiet, not waiting, but shifting, like the moment just before something unseen begins to move. And inside, the space between Ethan and the woman closed by a single step, not planned, not spoken, just happening. And for the first time since morning broke, neither of them looked toward the door. There is a moment, just before something changes, when the world feels too still to be real, and Ethan Cole felt it settle into his bones as the light stretched longer across the stable floor, the dust now fully awake in the air, drifting slow like it had all the time in the world. And outside, the riders did not move, not in any way that mattered. But the shape of their waiting had shifted, no longer patient, no longer testing. Something else now, something decided. And Ethan stood where he was, not turning, not stepping back, just holding the space between himself and the door like it was the only thing keeping the morning from breaking apart. And beside him, closer now than before, the woman did not look away either, her presence no longer separate from his. Not because trust had been earned, but because distance had stopped meaning anything at all. And the silence stretched until it almost felt like sound, until even the horses seemed to understand it. Standing quieter, their breaths slow and steady, as if they too were waiting for the same unseen signal. And then it came, not as a shout, not as a command, but as movement, soft at first, a shift of boots over dirt, the creak of leather repositioning, the faint sound of reins being gathered. And Ethan did not need to see it to know what it meant. They were closing the space, not rushing, not forcing, just narrowing it, one careful step at a time. And his eyes moved once, just once, to the woman beside him. And this time he did not look at the cord around her neck or the marks on her wrists. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has already become part of the decision he cannot undo. And she met his gaze without hesitation, no questions left there, no doubt. Just the same quiet certainty that had been building since the moment he cut the rope. And for a second, a small one, the world outside the stable ceased to matter, because inside, something had already been decided between them without a single word needing to be spoken. And then the voice came again, closer now, not at the door, but somewhere just beyond it, angled, measured. This is the last time I will say it. And the tone had changed, not louder, not harsher, just final, stripped of anything unnecessary. Step aside. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something he had been holding since the morning began. And he stepped forward, not toward the door, but into the line of it, placing himself exactly where he would need to be if that door opened. And he rested his hand lightly against the wood, not to hold it shut, not to brace it, just to feel it, to know where he stood in relation to what waited on the other side. And when he spoke, his voice carried no weight of argument, no edge of defiance, just something steady, something rooted deeper than either. No. And the word did not echo, did not rise. It simply existed, and outside, the stillness broke, not into chaos, not into noise, but into motion, controlled, deliberate, the kind that did not waste itself. And the riders shifted positions again, one moving farther down the fence line, another angling toward the far side of the stable, closing every open path without ever needing to run. And Ethan felt it, the way a man feels a storm long before he sees it, the pressure in the air, the quiet closing in of something larger than himself. And beside him, the woman moved as well, not stepping back, not seeking cover, but aligning, standing just behind his shoulder now, close enough that he could feel the presence of her there without turning. And that small shift, that single step, changed everything, because it was no longer a man standing alone in his barn. It was two people holding the same ground. And outside, the voice came one final time, not directed, not demanding, just spoken into the space like a truth that did not need to be forced. Then you have chosen. And Ethan did not answer, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said, and the light cut sharper across the floor. The day fully awake now, revealing every line, every shadow, every detail that had been hidden in the early hours. And in that clarity, Ethan understood something he had not seen when he first opened that door, something simple and unyielding, that whatever this was, whatever it would become in the next moment or the next hour, it was no longer about who she had been before she stepped into his stable, and it was no longer about who he had been before he chose not to open that door. It was about what stood here now, in this space, in this morning, and what neither of them would allow to be taken from it. And the sound outside settled into a new rhythm, not hooves, not voices, but preparation, the kind that came before something inevitable. And Ethan did not reach for a weapon, did not shift his stance into anything that resembled threat. He simply stood, steady, grounded, and beside him, the woman remained just as still, just as certain, and somewhere beyond the walls, the wind moved across the open land, carrying dust and light, and the faint scent of distant earth. And inside, in the quiet that followed, Ethan Cole realized that for the first time in years, he was not measuring what he might lose. He was measuring what he was no longer willing to give up, and that made all the difference in the world. The first real change did not come from the door. It came from the air itself, the kind of shift a man feels before he understands it. When the world tightens just enough to make every sound clearer, sharper, and Ethan Cole felt it, as the movement outside slowed instead of rushing forward, as if the men beyond the walls had reached the edge of something and chosen not to cross it yet. And that choice carried more weight than any force ever could, because it meant they were not desperate, they were certain, and certainty had a way of bending situations without ever raising its voice. And Ethan stood where he had placed himself, hands still resting lightly against the wood, not holding, not pushing, just knowing, while beside him the woman remained just behind his shoulder, close enough that her presence had become part of the space he occupied, no longer separate, no longer something he had to think about. And the silence stretched again, long enough for the horses to settle fully, their earlier unease fading into something quieter, something watchful, as if even they understood that whatever came next would not be decided by noise or speed. And then from outside came a different kind of sound, not footsteps, not shifting leather, but something softer, deliberate, the slow brushing of a hand against the side of the stable, moving along the wood, feeling its shape, its limits. And Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, because this was no longer about forcing a way in. It was about understanding the space, understanding him. And that meant the man outside was thinking the same way he was, measuring, waiting, choosing the moment instead of chasing it. And that made this something else entirely, something that could not be solved by instinct. Alone, and behind him, the woman spoke again, her voice steady, lower than before but clearer, as if the silence itself carried her words further. "He will not break the door," she said, and Ethan did not turn, but he listened. "No," he answered, because he understood that now too. The door was not the point, never had been, and the meaning settled into place between them like something that had been waiting to be seen. And for a brief moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, and in that stillness, Ethan became aware of something he had not noticed before, not outside, but within. The way his own breathing had changed, slower, more deliberate, not the breath of a man bracing for impact, but the breath of someone holding ground. And it surprised him, not because he did not understand it, but because he had not felt it in a long time, not since before the years had taught him to step back, to avoid, to let things pass instead of meeting them head on. And now here he was, not stepping back, not avoiding, just standing. And the realization did not come with pride. It came with clarity, quiet and steady, like the morning light cutting through the stable boards. And outside, the movement along the wall stopped, the brushing sound fading into stillness. And then the voice returned, not from the door, not from the side, but from a little distance now, positioned where it could carry without pressing. "You have already changed what this is," the man said, and there was no accusation in it, no anger, just a statement. And Ethan let the words settle, turning them over the way he had all the others. And he knew what the man meant. This was no longer a simple retrieval, no longer a matter of taking something and leaving. Something had shifted the moment he chose to close that door, and that shift could not be undone by either of them now. And Ethan's gaze moved once more to the narrow window, the sunlight now strong enough to reveal more of the yard, the riders still in place, but their posture different, less like a hunt, more like a boundary drawn. And the man who had spoken stood apart from them, not hidden, not forward, just present. And Ethan studied that shape for a moment, committing it to memory. And then he stepped back into shadow again, turning his attention inward, toward the space he held, toward the woman who had become part of it. And for the first time since the morning began, he spoke without looking at the door at all. "What happens if they leave without you?" he asked. And the question did not come from doubt. It came from understanding. From knowing that sometimes the greater weight was not in what was taken, but in what was left behind. And she answered without hesitation, without needing to consider it. "They will not leave without knowing." And the words carried something deeper than threat, something tied to honor, to expectation, to a line that could not be crossed quietly. And Ethan nodded once, slow, because he understood that too. Understood that this was no longer about taking or refusing. It was about acknowledgement, about what was seen and what was not. And outside, the wind picked up slightly, carrying dust across the open ground, brushing it against the walls in soft waves. And inside, the light shifted again, brighter, clearer, leaving fewer shadows to hide in. And Ethan felt the moment settling into something final, not because anything had happened yet, but because everything that mattered already had. And beside him, the woman stepped forward just enough to stand even with him now, not behind, not following, but beside. And that small movement carried more meaning than anything spoken so far. And Ethan did not look at her when she did it. He did not need to, because he felt it, the same way he felt the ground beneath his boots, solid, certain. And outside, the man's voice came one last time, quieter than before, but somehow clearer, as if the distance between them no longer mattered. "Then let us see what you have chosen." And the words did not demand, did not press. They simply opened the space for what came next. And inside, Ethan Cole did not move toward the door, did not reach for the latch. He simply stood where he was, no longer waiting, no longer deciding, just present in the choice he had already made. And for the first time since the stable door had opened that morning, the silence that followed did not feel like something about to break. It felt like something already set in place, unshaken, unmoved, and impossible to take back. Sometimes the truth does not arrive like a shout or a sudden change. Sometimes it comes the way light fills a room, slow and impossible to ignore once it is there. And Ethan Cole felt that kind of truth settling over the stable as the morning reached its full height, the shadows shrinking back, the dust losing its mystery. Everything laid bare in a clarity that left no space for hesitation. And outside, the men had stopped moving entirely, not because they were finished, but because they had reached the point where movement was no longer necessary. And that stillness carried a weight that pressed through the walls, through the ground, through the space between breaths. And Ethan stood in it, not resisting, not pushing against it, just holding his place within it, while beside him, the woman did the same, her presence now as steady as his own, no longer something that needed to be explained or justified, simply there, undeniable. And for a long moment, nothing changed, not in any visible way. And then the sound came, not from the door, not from the walls, but from farther out, the slow, deliberate rhythm of footsteps approaching across open ground, not hurried, not cautious, just certain, each step measured, each one placed with purpose. And Ethan's eyes shifted toward the narrow window again, catching a glimpse of movement that was different from the others, a single figure stepping forward from the line of riders, not flanked, not guarded, just alone, and that alone carried more meaning than any number of men standing behind him. Because a man who walked forward by himself did not expect to be stopped, and the realization settled into Ethan's chest with a quiet finality, and behind him, the woman spoke, her voice softer now, not because of fear, but because the moment did not need volume. "He comes," she said, and Ethan nodded once, not turning, not questioning, because he understood, and the footsteps drew closer, the sound of boots on dry earth clear now, steady, unbroken, and then they stopped just beyond the door, close enough that the presence could be felt without being seen, and for a moment, the world held its breath again, the kind of pause that does not belong to uncertainty, but to acknowledgement. And then the voice came, not the same as before, not carried from a distance, but spoken from just beyond the wood, low, controlled, and unmistakably different. "You have made this more complicated than it needed to be." And Ethan listened to it. Not just the words, but the space behind them, the calm that did not need to prove itself. And he answered without stepping forward, without changing his position. "It was never simple," he said. And the truth of that settled between them, unchallenged, and outside, the man exhaled slowly, the sound faint but present. And then there was a shift, not in stance, not in tone, but in direction. "Open the door," he said, not as a command, not as a request, but as something that existed between the two. And inside, Ethan did not move, did not reach for the latch, did not even glance toward it, because the door was no longer the question, and beside him, the woman stepped fully into the light now, no longer behind him, no longer aligned at his shoulder, but standing where she could be seen if the door opened. And Ethan noticed that, the way she chose not to remain hidden, the way she stepped forward into whatever came next, and it changed something again, small but undeniable, and the silence stretched, longer this time, not waiting, not pressing, just existing. And then Ethan spoke, not to the door, not to the man beyond it, but into the space itself. "You already know the answer." And outside, there was no immediate reply, only the faint sound of breath, steady, controlled. And then the man spoke again, quieter now, but somehow carrying more weight. "Then we will speak without it," he said. And that was when Ethan understood, truly understood, that this was no longer about entry, no longer about taking or refusing. It was about recognition, about seeing and being seen. And he stepped away from the door, just enough that his voice would carry clearly, just enough that the space between them was no longer defined by wood and iron. And he spoke. "Again, say what you came to say." And outside, the man did not answer immediately. And in that pause, something shifted, something deeper than movement or sound, something that settled into the ground itself. And when the voice came again, it carried no edge, no force, just truth. "She does not belong to you." And inside, Ethan's gaze moved to the woman, not to question, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge her presence. And she met his eyes, steady, unflinching, and for the first time since the morning began, there was something there that had not been before, not guarded, not measured, just clear. And Ethan turned back toward the door, his expression unchanged, his stance unmoved, and he answered, "She is not yours either." And the words settled into the space between them, not as defiance, not as challenge, but as something final, something that could not be undone by anything that followed. And outside, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, full of understanding, full of something that neither side needed to explain. And the man did not step forward, did not reach for the door. He simply stood where he was. And in that stillness, the morning seemed to hold itself in place, waiting not for action, but for what came after the truth had been spoken. Aloud. Truth does not need to be raised to be heard. And in that moment, standing on either side of a simple wooden wall, Both men understood that what had been said could not be taken back, and what had not been said carried just as much weight. And Ethan Cole stood in the center of his stable, with the morning light cutting clean lines across the ground, his hand no longer touching the door, no longer needing to. Because the barrier between them was no longer wood, it was choice, and beside him, the woman remained in the light, no longer shadowed, no longer hidden, her presence as clear as the sun that had climbed above the hills. And outside, the man did not move right away, did not answer with force or urgency. He simply stood there, absorbing the words the way a man absorbs the shape of a landscape before deciding how to cross it. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not in tone, but in depth, as if something beneath it had settled into place. "You speak like a man who believes he understands what stands beside him," he said, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he doubted, but because he knew the answer was not something that needed to be defended, and he glanced once at the woman, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, and she met his gaze without hesitation, the same steady certainty in her eyes. And that was enough, and Ethan turned back toward the door, his voice calm. "Even, I understand enough," he said, and outside, there was a pause, longer than before, the kind that stretches when something unexpected has been introduced into a situation that was once simple. And the man shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dry earth. And when he spoke again, it was no longer to challenge, but to reveal. "She walked into my camp under nightfall," he said, "not as a prisoner, not as a stranger, but as one who carried a mark that belongs to my people." And inside, the woman's shoulders tightened just a fraction, not from fear, but from recognition, and Ethan felt that change without turning, felt it in the way the air shifted, and the man continued. "That mark does not bind her to me," he said, "but it binds me to her." And the words settled heavily, carrying meaning that reached beyond simple ownership or claim, something tied to responsibility, to expectation, to a code that did not need explanation to be understood. And Ethan listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, because he recognized the truth in the way it was spoken. And outside, the man took a slow breath before continuing. "And now she stands inside your walls," he said, "and you say she is not mine." And there was no accusation in it, only a question that did not need to be asked directly. And Ethan's gaze drifted once more to the woman, to the cord at her neck, to the small piece of stone that caught the light just enough to remind him of something he still could not place. And he realized then that whatever this was, whatever it meant, it was larger than the two men standing on either side of the door, larger than the land beneath their feet. And for a moment, the weight of that truth pressed into him, not to move him, but to steady him. And he spoke again, slower this time, choosing each word with care. "She is standing here because she chose to stand here," he said, and beside him, the woman did not move, did not speak, but the space around her seemed to settle more firmly, as if the ground itself acknowledged the truth of what had been said. And outside, the man was quiet again, and in that quiet, something shifted, not in position, not in stance, but in understanding. And when he spoke next, his voice carried something new, not challenge, not insistence, but recognition. "Choice carries weight," he said, "but so does what came before it." And the words hung there, bridging the space between past and present, between what had been and what now stood in its place. And Ethan let them settle, not rejecting them, not accepting them fully either, just holding them in the same way he held everything else that morning, steady, without rush. And he nodded once, though the man outside could not see it. And then he spoke. "Then we stand where those things meet." And the simplicity of it carried more truth than anything that could have been argued. And outside, the wind moved again, brushing across the open land, lifting dust in soft waves that passed along the stable walls. And the man did not answer right away, because there was nothing left to push against, nothing left to force. And when he finally spoke, it was quieter than before, but clearer. "Then she will speak," he said. And inside, the words settled into the space like something final, something inevitable. And Ethan turned, not toward the door this time, but toward the woman fully, giving her the space that had always been hers but had only now been named. And she stood there in the light, no longer between two sides, no longer something to be claimed or defended, but something else entirely, something that neither man could define without her. And for the first time since the stable door had opened that morning, the moment shifted away from him, away from the man outside, and rested entirely with her. There are moments when the world does not move forward until someone decides it should, and inside the stable, with the sun now fully risen and the dust hanging still in the air, everything seemed to rest on that one quiet space where the woman stood, not behind Ethan, not beside him, but on her own ground, and Ethan stepped back without thinking, not far, not enough to distance himself, just enough to make it clear that the space was hers now, that whatever came next would not come through him. And the wood of the stable creaked softly as the heat began to settle into it, the smell of hay and leather thickening in the morning light. And outside, no one spoke, no one moved, because they were waiting, not for permission, not for command, but for her. And she stood there for a long moment, her eyes not on Ethan, not on the door, but somewhere between, as if she were measuring something that could not be seen, something that existed, beyond the walls, beyond the men outside, beyond even the man standing just a few feet from her. And then she reached up, slow, deliberate, her fingers finding the thin cord at her neck, and Ethan's gaze followed the movement without meaning to, drawn to it the same way it had been before. But this time he did not look away when the small stone caught the light, did not dismiss the feeling that stirred in him, and she pulled the cord free. The motion simple, practiced, and the pendant rested in her palm, turning slightly as it caught the sun, revealing its shape more clearly than it had before, and something in Ethan's chest tightened, not with fear, not with confusion, but with recognition that had been waiting just beneath the surface, and she held it there for a moment, not showing it to him, not hiding it either, just letting it exist in the space between them. And then she spoke, her voice steady, carrying no strain, no hesitation. "This was given to my grandmother," she said. And the words settled into the stable like something older than the morning, older than the land itself. And Ethan felt the memory come then, not sudden, not sharp, but slow and certain, the image of a woman he had only seen once as a boy, standing at the edge of a small camp his mother had brought him to when sickness had spread through the valley, a woman who had worn the same kind of stone, the same quiet strength in her eyes. And he had not understood it then, had not remembered it clearly, until now. But the feeling of it had stayed, buried somewhere beneath years of distance and silence. And the woman in front of him continued, her gaze steady. She said it would find its way back when it was needed. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something he had been holding for far longer than this morning. And outside, the man spoke again. But this time his voice carried something different, not challenge, not insistence, but recognition. "That stone belongs to a healer," he said, and the truth of it seemed to settle over everything at once. The stable, the land, the men waiting beyond the walls. And the woman nodded once, not toward the door, but to the truth itself. She said, "And now it is mine." And there was no claim in it, no ownership, just continuation. And Ethan felt something shift again, deeper than before, not in the situation, but in himself, in the way he saw what stood in front of him, not as someone who had arrived in his stable by chance, not as someone he had chosen to protect out of instinct, but as something tied to a line that had crossed his own life long before he understood it. And he looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, the question that had been there since the beginning no longer mattered, not who she was to the man outside, not why she had come here, but who she was in this moment, standing in the light, holding something that carried more weight than either of them had spoken aloud. And outside, the man was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier. "Then you know what it means," he said. And the woman did not answer right away, because she did not need to, because the meaning was already there, in the way she stood, in the way she held the pendant, in the way the morning itself seemed to settle around her. And then she spoke, not to the man outside, not to Ethan, but to the space itself. "It means I choose where I stand," she said, and the words did not rise, did not carry force. They simply existed, and in that moment, everything else seemed to fall away, the riders, the tension, the question of what came next, all of it narrowing down to that single truth, and Ethan felt it settle into him. not as something new, but as something he had already known without words. And outside, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of something that could not be argued or taken. And the man did not speak again right away. And when he finally did, his voice carried no resistance, no attempt to reclaim what had already been spoken. "Then stand," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything before. And inside, the woman lowered her hand slightly, the pendant still resting in her palm, and she did not move, did not step forward or back. She simply stood, and Ethan Cole realized then that the door between them had never been the real barrier, and that whatever had been decided in this place would not be undone by anything that waited beyond it. The morning did not change when she spoke. The sun did not pause. The wind did not turn. But something deeper than all of that shifted in a way that could not be seen, only felt, like the ground settling after a long strain. And Ethan Cole stood there watching her, the pendant still resting in her open palm, catching light with every small movement of her breath. And for the first time since this began, there was no question left in the space between them, no tension pulling in opposite directions, just a quiet certainty that had found its place. And outside, the man did not answer her words with argument or force. He accepted them the way a man accepts the edge of a river he cannot cross without consequence. And the silence that followed was not resistance. It was recognition, and Ethan turned his gaze toward the door again, not with urgency, not with caution, but with a clarity that had not been there before. And the wood no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like something temporary, something that had already served its purpose. And beside him, the woman closed her fingers slowly around the stone, not hiding it, just holding it with a kind of quiet finality. And she stepped forward one small step, not toward the door, but into the center of the stable, grounding herself fully in the space she had chosen. And Ethan understood then that whatever came next would not be decided by him, not by the men outside, but by the truth she had already spoken. And outside, the man's voice came. Again, softer now, stripped of anything unnecessary. "Then it is done," he said, and there was no disappointment in it, no frustration, only acceptance. And that carried more weight than anything that had been said before, because acceptance does not come from weakness, it comes from understanding. And Ethan felt that settle into him as well, not as relief, not as victory, but as something steadier, something that did not need to be proven. And the sound of movement followed, not rushed, not abrupt, just the slow turning of horses, the shifting of weight as riders adjusted their direction. And for the first time since the morning began, the pressure in the air began to ease, not disappearing, but lifting just enough to be noticed. And Ethan listened to it, the way the land itself seemed to breathe again. And he stepped forward, reaching for the latch, not because he needed to, but because the moment had come to open what had already been resolved. And he lifted it slowly, the iron cool against his hand. And for a second he paused, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what had just passed through that space. And then he pulled the door open, and the light flooded in fully, no longer filtered through cracks and shadows, revealing the yard beyond in sharp detail. The riders already turning away, their figures calm, unhurried, and the man who had stood at the door now several feet back, facing the stable, not as someone denied, but as someone who had witnessed something he would carry with him. And Ethan stepped into the doorway, not crossing it, just standing where inside met outside. And the man met his gaze. And for a moment neither spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to claim. And then the man inclined his head slightly, not in submission, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. And Ethan returned it without thinking, the gesture simple, unspoken, and final. And the riders moved on, their figures growing smaller against the wide stretch of land, the sound of hooves fading into the distance until it became part of the wind itself. And the silence that followed was different from any that had come before, not heavy, not waiting, but open, the kind that belongs to something that has ended without breaking. And Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching the horizon where they disappeared. And then he turned back inside, and the stable felt different now, not because anything had changed in its structure, but because of what had passed through it, what had settled into its walls, into the ground beneath it. And she stood there still, in the center, the pendant once again resting against her chest, her posture unchanged, steady, certain. And for a moment, they simply looked at each other, not as strangers, not as opposites, but as two people who had stood in the same moment and chosen not to step away from it. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something he no longer needed to carry, and he stepped further inside, letting the door remain open behind him, because there was no longer anything to keep out, and the morning moved on around them, the light shifting, the dust settling, the quiet returning to the kind that belongs to a place at peace. And Ethan Cole realized then that nothing in his life had changed in a way that could be seen from the outside. The land was still his, the stable still stood, the day would move forward as it always had, but something within it, something that could not be measured or named, had settled into place, and it would not leave when the sun went down, and it would not fade with time, because some things, once chosen, remain long after the moment has passed. The quiet that followed did not feel like an ending. It felt like something waiting to be understood, the kind of quiet that settles in after a storm that never quite arrived. And Ethan Cole stood just inside the open stable door, the wide land stretching out before him in long lines of sunlit dust and distant hills, the riders now nothing more than faint shapes fading into the horizon. And for a moment he did not move, because movement was not what the moment asked for. It asked for stillness, for recognition, for the kind of pause that lets a man see what has changed without needing to name it. And behind him, the soft shift of boots against packed earth reminded him that he was no longer alone in that space. And he turned slowly, not out of caution, not out of habit, but because the moment had turned with him. And she was there, still standing where she had chosen to stand, the pendant resting once more against her chest, catching only the faintest trace of light now that the sun had moved higher, and there was no urgency in her posture, no sign that she would leave or stay, just presence, grounded and certain in a way that did not ask for permission. And Ethan studied her for a long moment, not searching for answers, not expecting explanation, just taking in the fact of her being there, the way a man takes in a change in the land that he knows will remain long after he stops looking at it. And he finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been before, not because it needed to be, but because the space between them did not require anything louder. "You can go," he said, and the words did not push her away. They simply opened the path that had always been hers, and she did not answer right away, did not move toward the door, did not step back into shadow. She simply stood, her eyes meeting his with that same steady clarity that had carried her through every moment of the morning. And when she spoke, her voice carried no question, no hesitation. "I know," she said, and that was all. And something in Ethan's chest shifted at that, not in surprise, not in disappointment, but in recognition of what it meant, because she was not waiting for permission, she was choosing something else. And he nodded once, slow, accepting the truth of that without needing to understand it fully. And the wind moved lightly through the open doorway, carrying the dry scent of the land into the stable, brushing against the hay, stirring the dust just enough to remind them both that the world outside continued as it always had, unchanged by what had passed within these walls, and yet not untouched by it either. And Ethan stepped back further into the stable, giving the doorway fully to her, the open land beyond it stretching wide and clear, a path without obstruction, without demand. And she turned then, not quickly, not reluctantly, just with the same deliberate movement that had defined everything she had done since he first saw her. And she walked toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried, each one placed with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where she stands. And Ethan watched her, not following, not stopping her, just witnessing the moment the way he had witnessed everything else that morning, without interference, without need. And she reached the threshold and paused, just for a breath, just long enough for the light to fall fully across her face, revealing the quiet strength there, the kind that does not need to prove itself. And she did not look back right away, did not turn to him, but after that single breath, she spoke, her voice carrying out into the open land as much as it stayed within the stable. "You stood when you did not have to," she said, and the words settled into the space between them, not as praise, not as gratitude, but as truth. And Ethan did not answer immediately, because the meaning of it reached further than a simple reply. And when he did speak, his voice was steady, unchanged, "So did you," he said, and she nodded once. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough. And then she stepped out into the sunlight, crossing the threshold without hesitation, without pause, and the land seemed to receive her the way it receives everything that belongs to it, without question, without resistance. And Ethan remained where he was, just inside the doorway, watching as she moved a few steps forward into the open, and then stopped, not turning back, not moving away, simply standing. And for a moment, it seemed as though the distance between them had returned, the space that had once separated them now visible again, defined by light and shadow and open ground. And yet it did not feel the same. It did not carry the same weight, because something had already crossed it that could not be undone. And Ethan leaned one shoulder lightly against the frame of the door, not in fatigue, not in relief, just in quiet acknowledgement of the moment as it settled into something lasting. And the stable behind him felt different now, not empty, not changed in any way that could be touched, but marked by what had happened within it. And he knew, without needing to think it through, that the morning would not leave him the way other mornings had, that it would remain in the quiet spaces between days, in the choices that came after, in the way he stood when standing mattered. And outside, she remained where she was, facing the open land, the wind moving lightly through her hair, the pendant at her chest catching the sun in brief flashes. And Ethan Cole realized then that sometimes what a man chooses to hold is not meant to stay, and sometimes what he lets stand beside him is not meant to be kept, and yet both can change him in ways that never fade. And he did not move, did not call out, did not step forward. He simply stood there, watching the line where the light met the land, and knowing that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had almost been taken, but by what had been allowed to remain. There are days that pass like dust on the wind, unnoticed, unremembered, and then there are days that settle into a man's bones and refuse to leave. And Ethan Cole felt the difference as he stood in the doorway of his stable, the sunlight stretching long across the ground, the land quiet in a way that no longer felt empty. And she was still there, just beyond the threshold, not walking away, not returning, simply standing where the open earth met the line of his world, and the distance between them was no longer something to measure. It was something understood, something that did not need to be crossed to be real. And Ethan did not move toward her, did not call out, because the moment did not belong to action. It belonged to recognition. And the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant hills, brushing past her and into the stable. And for a brief second, the pendant at her chest caught the light again, a small flicker that seemed to anchor everything that had happened into something that would not fade. And she lifted her hand once more, not to show it, not to hide it, but to rest her fingers lightly against it, as if confirming it was still there, as if confirming that what had passed was not something imagined. And then she turned slightly, not fully away, not fully toward him, just enough to shift the angle of her presence, and she spoke again, her voice carrying easily through the open space. "There are places where standing means nothing," she said, "and there are places where it changes everything." And Ethan listened, the words settling into him without resistance, without the need to answer, because he already knew which kind of place this had been. And he nodded once, almost to himself, and the silence that followed was not heavy, not uncertain. It was full, the kind that holds meaning without needing to explain it. And then she took a step, just one, not away, not toward, but along the edge of the space between them, as if tracing the line that had been drawn and then erased all in the same morning. And Ethan watched her, not with expectation, not with hesitation, just with the quiet awareness that whatever she chose next would not undo what had already been decided. And she paused again, her gaze moving across the land, then back toward the stable. And for the first time since she had stepped outside, her eyes met his fully again, not measuring, not questioning, just seeing. And there was something there now that had not been before, something that did not need a name, something that existed simply because of what had passed between them. And she spoke once more, quieter this time, but no less clear. "You think this ends here," she said. And Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not understand, but because he knew that endings and beginnings out here rarely announced themselves. They simply shifted from one into the other without warning, and he stepped forward. Then, not crossing the threshold, just closing the space by a single step, enough to stand fully in the doorway, the light and shadow meeting at his boots. And he spoke, his voice steady, grounded in something that had taken shape over the course of the morning. "It does not end," he said. "It just changes shape." And she held his gaze for a moment longer, and then a small movement passed through her expression, not a smile, not quite, but something close enough to be felt, and she nodded once. Slow, as if acknowledging a truth that did not belong to either of them alone, and the wind shifted again, stronger this time, lifting dust in small spirals across the ground, carrying it past her and into the open, and she turned then, fully now, facing the wide stretch of land ahead, and for a moment it seemed as though she would walk away, that the story of this morning would settle into memory as so many others had, quiet, unspoken, left behind, and Ethan remained where he was, not reaching, not stopping her, because he understood that some things are not held by force, they are held by the choice to remain, and she took another step, and then another, slow, measured, the distance between them beginning to stretch once more, and the light caught the pendant. Again, a brief flash that seemed to echo the moment it had first drawn his attention, and then she stopped, not far, but not close either, and she did not turn back right away. She simply stood there, the land open before her, the stable behind her, and then she spoke, her voice carried lightly by the wind. "I did not come here by accident," she said, and the words settled into the space with a quiet weight, and Ethan felt them land, not as surprise, not as confusion, but as something that completed a circle he had not realized had been forming, and he did not ask why, did not ask how, because those questions no longer mattered, and she turned her head just slightly, enough that her voice carried back toward him more clearly. "And I do not leave it without reason," she added, and the meaning of that stayed between them, unspoken, unresolved, and yet fully understood, and Ethan Cole stood in the doorway of his stable, the same place where the morning had begun, and realized that some doors, once opened, do not close the same way again, no matter how still the land may seem afterward. Some stories do not end with a man riding away or a door closing behind him. Some end in the quiet space where nothing more needs to be said, and Ethan Cole stood in that space as the morning stretched into something fuller, the light no longer sharp but settled, the kind that lays across the land and stays there, and she stood a short distance away, not leaving, not returning, just present in the place where her choice had brought her, and the wind moved gently between them, carrying the dry scent of earth and sun-warmed grass, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because the truth had already been spoken in ways that words could not improve, and Ethan stepped forward then, not out of urgency, not out of uncertainty, but because standing still had given way to something quieter, something that asked to be lived instead of understood, and he crossed the threshold fully this time, boots pressing into the same ground she stood on, not claiming it, not changing it, just sharing it. And she turned her head slightly as he approached, her eyes finding his again, and there was no tension there now, no question left hanging between them. Only the recognition of two people who had stood on opposite sides of something and chosen not to remain there, and Ethan stopped a few feet from her, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance. And for a moment he said nothing, because anything he might have said would have been smaller than what already existed, and she watched him with that same steady calm, the pendant resting against her chest, no longer something to be explained, just something that belonged to the path she had walked and the one she would continue to walk. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but certain. "You opened the door," she said, and Ethan let out a slow breath, not a sigh, not relief, just acknowledgement, and he nodded once. "And you stayed," he answered, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything that had been spoken that morning, because it was not about what had almost been taken or what had been defended. It was about what had remained, what had been chosen, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she looked out across the land again, the wide stretch of it unchanged, endless in the way it always had been, and yet somehow different now, as if it had witnessed something it would not forget, and she reached up once more, her fingers brushing lightly against the pendant, not to draw attention to it, but to settle it back into place, and then she let her hand fall to her side. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something softer, something that did not need to be held tightly. There will be days when this feels far away, she said, and days when it does not. And Ethan listened, understanding more in the spaces between her words than in the words themselves, and he nodded slowly, because he knew that kind of truth, had lived with it long before this morning had come, and he spoke in return, just as quietly. Out here, nothing ever really leaves. And she glanced back at him then, and this time there was the faintest trace of something that might have been a smile, not full, not open, but enough to show that she understood. And the wind shifted again, stronger now, carrying dust across the ground in soft lines that moved past them both. And she took a step, not away, not toward, just forward into the open land. And Ethan did not follow, did not stop her, because he knew that what stood between them was not something that needed to be held in place. It would remain whether they stood side by side or miles apart. And she walked a few paces, then slowed, and for a brief moment it seemed as though she might turn back. But instead she continued, her figure moving steadily across the open ground, the distance growing in a way that did not feel like loss. And Ethan stood where he was, watching until she became part of the land itself, until the line between her and the horizon blurred into something that could no longer be separated. And the stable behind him stood open, the door still wide, the shadow inside now just another part of the morning. And he turned back toward it after a while, not because he was leaving the moment behind, but because it had already settled into him, into the way he stood, the way he would choose when the next moment came. And he stepped inside slowly, the sound of his boots soft against the packed earth, the familiar space now carrying something new within it, something that did not need to be seen to be known. And he paused once more just inside, glancing back at the open doorway, at the wide land beyond it, and for a second, just a second, the world felt perfectly still, not waiting, not changing, just existing exactly as it should. And then he reached up and rested his hand lightly against the door, not closing it, not yet, just feeling the wood beneath his palm, and out here, where the land stretched farther than any man could follow, and the wind carried stories no one could fully tell. Ethan Cole understood something simple and certain, that justice did not always arrive with force, that it did not need to be claimed or proven. Sometimes it stood quietly in a place where a man chose not to step aside, and sometimes that was enough.